At 4:17 in the morning, the bakery on Vine Street smelled of butter that had been pulled from the cold room exactly 9 minutes earlier, and was now resting on a slab of pale marble that had been quarried 80 years ago from a hillside in Carrara. The marble had not been quarried for a bakery. It had been quarried for the lobby of a bank that had failed during a panic in the 1930s, and the slab had moved through several lives and several owners, into several cities before arriving. By the slow, indirect routes that very old stones often arrived at the rooms that needed them, in the back of a small storefront patisserie on the corner of Vine and 11th. The marble was cold to the touch even in August. It was the only surface in the city, the baker had once been told by a man who had spent 40 years as a pastry chef in Lyon, on which she could properly laminate a dough at 5 in the morning in the middle of a humid autumn. The baker stood at the marble in the half-dark of her own kitchen, with her hands resting flat against the stone. The small overhead bulb above the work table was the only light in the building. The front of the bakery, the 7 small round tables, and the glass case and the chalkboard menu, and the brass cash register that she had bought at an estate sale, her first month in business, was still in the kind of complete pre-dawn darkness that her customers would not see until she unlocked the front door at 6:30, and turned on the warmer overhead lights and propped the door open to let the smell of the morning's bread out into the street. For now, the front of the bakery did not exist. For now, only the small square of light over the marble existed, and the cold stone, and the block of butter that was now at exactly 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dough that had been resting in the cold room since midnight, and had now been brought out to begin its third lamination turn. She lifted the dough from the small linen-covered tray she had wrapped it in at midnight. The dough was a pale yellow cream, and was approximately the size and shape of a thick book, and its surface was so smooth that it caught the light from the overhead bulb in a single soft sheen. She set the dough on the marble. She picked up the long oak rolling pin she had been using for the entire 8 years she had been in this country, and she placed it across the dough at the angle her grandmother had taught her, the angle that produced an even pressure across the entire length of the pin without requiring her shoulders to do any of the work, and she began to roll. The dough lengthened beneath the pin in a slow, patient extension, and the butter inside it, encased in its careful envelope of dough, did not break and did not leak and did not warm beyond the precise temperature at which it would remain a single coherent layer rather than dissolving into the dough around it. Her name on her birth certificate had been Sophia Caterina Marchetti. Her name on the small sign above the door of the bakery, hand-lettered in pale gold paint by a sign painter she had hired when she first opened, was simply Caterina's. She had not used the name Marchetti in 20 years. She had not, in fact, used any of the names she had once been called, by anyone, except the middle name her grandmother had given her on the day of her christening, in a small whitewashed church, in a small whitewashed village in the western part of Sicily. The middle name had been the name of her grandmother's mother, who had been a midwife in the village in the years before the war, and the name had been the only thing she had taken with her when she had left the place she had been born, and had not returned. She finished the third turn of the lamination, and folded the dough in the precise trifold her hands had been performing since she was 11 years old, the year her grandmother had first allowed her to stand at the marble of the kitchen of the old farmhouse and to roll out a small practice piece of dough that had not been intended for anyone to eat. She wrapped the folded dough in the linen cloth and slid it back into the cold room. She set the timer above the marble for 40 minutes. She turned to the small sink at her station and washed her hands in cold water, and she dried them on the same kind of plain white towel she had been drying them on for as long as she had been alive, and she returned to the small wooden stool beside the marble where she always rested between turns, and she sat down, and she allowed her shoulders, for the first time since she had begun the lamination at 4:15, to drop 1/4 of an inch. The phone rang. The phone was an old beige rotary unit she had bought, like the cash register, at an estate sale her first month in business, and she had kept it because the woman she had bought it from had told her that it had belonged to a small shoe repair shop that had been on the same block for 50 years, and Sophia had liked the idea of a phone that had spent its life ringing for the kind of small one-person business she was now running. The phone hung on the wall beside the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the front room. It rang now in the same way it had rung every time it had ever rung in her bakery, with a small mechanical bell that vibrated against a brass plate inside the housing, and produced a sound that no modern phone would have been able to produce, because no modern phone contained a brass plate, or a mechanical bell. She did not answer it on the first ring. She did not, as a rule, answer the phone at 4:20 in the morning, because the phone at 4:20 in the morning was almost never anyone she wanted to talk to, and because most of the people who needed to reach her at that hour knew not to call her at the bakery, and would have called her at her apartment instead. The phone rang a second time. She did not answer it. The phone rang a third time, and the third ring was the ring she had learned over the years to pay attention to, because the people who called her at 4:20 in the morning and let the phone ring 3 times in a row were the people who had decided in advance that they were not going to give up easily, and Sophia had found that ignoring such people generally produced more inconvenient outcomes than answering them. She rose from the stool. She crossed the small kitchen in 3 steps and lifted the receiver from its cradle, and she held it to her ear, and she said the small 2-syllable greeting in Italian that she had been answering her grandmother's phone with as a child, and that she still, after 20 years in this country, had never replaced with an English equivalent. The voice on the other end of the line was a voice she had not heard before. It was a man's voice, low and unhurried, and pitched at the kind of register that suggested its owner had not, in a great many years, raised it to be heard by anyone. The voice did not introduce itself. It did not apologize for the hour. It did not engage in any of the small formalities that ordinary callers use to begin ordinary conversations with strangers. It said in English that the speaker would like to reserve her bakery for the entirety of the coming Thursday afternoon, from 1 in the afternoon until 5, and that the speaker would compensate her for the loss of business at a rate that would more than cover any expected revenue, and that the speaker would expect the bakery to be empty of customers and staff during those hours, except for the speaker and a small number of his guests. The voice said all of this in the same unhurried register, without any rising inflection at the end of the sentences, in the manner of a person who had no expectation of being refused, because no one had refused him in a sufficiently long time that the experience had ceased to feature in his planning. Sophia listened to the voice for the duration of perhaps 4 sentences. She listened to it the way she had once listened, as a child, to the voices of the men who came and went through the courtyard of her grandfather's house on Sundays, after the long midday meal had finished, and the women had retreated to the kitchen, and the men had remained in the courtyard, with their small glasses of grappa. She had listened to those voices from the small high window of the room she shared with her cousin, and she had learned, over the course of many Sundays, that there was a particular register that certain men used when they were giving instructions to other men, a register pitched precisely between command and conversation, and that the men who used this register were the men whose instructions were always eventually followed. The voice on the phone in her bakery was using that register now. She recognized it the way one recognizes the smell of a flower one has not encountered since childhood. She did not let the voice finish. She did not, in fact, let the voice complete the sentence it was in the middle of, which was a sentence about the precise time at which the speaker's guests would begin to arrive on the coming Thursday, and the precise number of them that should be expected. She said in the same neutral conversational tone she would have used to refuse a request to extend her hours for a private birthday party, that she was in the middle of a croissant batch, and that she did not take reservations of the kind he was describing, and that he was welcome to come to the bakery during her ordinary business hours along with everyone else, and she put the receiver back into the cradle. The small mechanical bell inside the phone produced a single soft click as the cradle settled. The kitchen returned to its previous quiet. The timer above the marble continued its slow countdown of the 40 minutes the dough needed to rest. Sophia stood beside the phone for the duration of perhaps 2 seconds, with her hand still on the receiver, and she thought about the voice she had just hung up on, and she allowed herself to register, for the first time since she had picked up the receiver, the small specific quality of the silence that had been on the other end of the line in the half-second between her last word and her placement of the receiver back into the cradle. The silence had not been a confused silence. It had been a precise, attentive silence. It had been the silence of a person who had not been hung up on in a very long time, and was now taking the experience seriously. She returned to her stool beside the marble. She did not in any conscious way regret what she had done. She had spent 20 years constructing a life in which she did not have to think about the men who used the particular register the voice on the phone had used, and the construction of that life had been the entire purpose of her decision to leave the place she had been born, and she was not, at 4:20 in the morning on a Tuesday, going to surrender any portion of that construction to a man whose name she did not know and whose business she did not want to be involved in. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in once through her nose and registered the smell of the resting butter and the resting dough and the small lingering trace of the cold water soap she had washed her hands with, and she allowed the smell to settle her in the way that the smells of her own kitchen had settled her every morning for 8 years. The timer above the marble had counted down 6 minutes when she heard the first knock on the front door of the bakery. The knock was not a customer's knock. Sophia had been opening her bakery at 6:30 in the morning for 8 years, and in those 8 years she had learned the small particular sounds that customers made when they arrived too early and had to wait outside on the sidewalk. Customers tapped lightly with one knuckle. Customers cupped their hands against the glass and peered in. Customers knocked once and then waited, and then knocked again with a small embarrassed apology in the second knock for the existence of the first. The knock that was happening now on her front door was none of these things. It was a heavy, urgent, 4-beat rhythm performed with the flat of an open hand against the wood of the doorframe beside the glass, and it had the unmistakable quality of a knock that did not expect to wait. Sophia rose from her stool a second time. She did not hurry. She crossed the small kitchen, pushed through the swinging door, and walked the length of the dark front room with the unhurried steps of a person who had decided, in some small place inside herself, that whatever was happening on the other side of her front door was now part of her morning, and that the best way to handle it would be to handle it without losing the rhythm she had been maintaining since 4:15. She arrived at the door. She did not turn on the front lights. She lifted the small linen curtain that hung over the inside of the door's window and looked through the glass at the figure standing on the sidewalk under the street lamp. He was not what she had expected. She had expected, if she had expected anything, a thug, a man who matched in some recognizable way the voice she had heard on the phone, a man whose presence on her sidewalk would have confirmed her decision to hang up. The figure on the other side of the glass was not a thug. He was perhaps 60 years old, and he was dressed in a long, dark wool coat that had been tailored for him in a workshop she could not have named, but could have placed within a particular small district in a particular European capital. And he was not wearing a hat despite the cold pre-dawn drizzle that had begun to fall on the empty street. His hair was silver and was combed back from a high forehead in a single, smooth wave. His face was the face of a man who had spent a great deal of his life being the second most important person in any room he entered, and who had developed, in the course of doing so, a particular kind of patient, watchful intelligence that was different from the intelligence of the men he served. He was holding, in both of his hands in front of his chest, a bouquet of white peonies wrapped in plain brown paper. Sophia let the curtain fall back across the glass. She unlocked the front door. She did not open it all the way. She opened it perhaps 10 inches, and she stood in the gap with one hand on the inside knob and the other resting against the frame, in the small defensive posture of a woman who had been opening doors to strangers in pre-dawn hours since she was 12 years old and had learned how to do it in a way that did not commit her to any particular outcome. The man on the sidewalk did not step forward. He did not, in fact, move at all, except to incline his head 1/4 of an inch in a small, precise greeting, and he said in a soft, accented English that placed his original language somewhere along the same coastline her own original language had come from, that his name was Marco, and that he was very sorry for the hour, and that he was here on behalf of the man whose call she had ended 10 minutes ago, and that the man whose call she had ended 10 minutes ago wished her to know that he had not intended to give her offense, and that Marco himself was here to apologize on his behalf, and to ask whether she might consider returning the call at a time of her own choosing. Sophia did not respond immediately. She looked at Marco. She looked at the peonies in his hands. She looked at the empty street behind him, where there was no parked car visible within the range of her front window, which meant that whatever vehicle had brought him to her sidewalk had been left at a deliberate distance, in the way that men of a certain professional habit always left their vehicles at deliberate distances. She looked back at his face, and she registered, in the small economic way her eyes had been trained to register such things since she was a child, the particular arrangement of his features, and the particular way his hands held the flowers, and the particular way his weight rested on his back foot rather than his front foot. And she understood with the same instantaneous certainty with which she had recognized the register of the voice on the phone, that the man on her sidewalk was a man who had grown up in the same kind of household she had grown up in, and that the bouquet of peonies in his hands was a gesture from a vocabulary they both understood. She opened the door wider. She stepped back. She said in the soft, accented English that she rarely used, but that had risen automatically to her mouth in response to his, that he could come in if he wished, and that she had coffee in the back, and that she could not stop her work, but that he could sit at one of the small front tables, and she could speak to him through the open kitchen door while she finished her batch. Marco stepped across the threshold. He stepped carefully, the way he had clearly stepped across many other thresholds in his life, with the small attention to the geometry of an unfamiliar room that was the inheritance of a long career in the service of a man whose safety depended on the recognition of small details. He let his eyes pass once around the dark front room of the bakery, and his eyes registered the 7 small round tables, and the glass case and the chalkboard menu, and the brass cash register, and the small framed photographs on the back wall behind the counter that no one ever looked at, and his eyes performed all of this registration in the duration of perhaps 2 seconds, and then he turned his attention back to Sophia. He held out the peonies. He said very simply that they were for her, and that they were not a part of any negotiation, and that he had brought them because his mother had taught him, when he was a boy, that one did not arrive at a woman's door in the early morning empty-handed, regardless of the reason for the arrival. Sophia took the flowers. She took them in the way her grandmother had taught her to take flowers from men who arrived unannounced, with one hand under the wrapped stems and the other lightly across the top of the paper, and she brought them briefly to her face and breathed in once. The peonies smelled the way peonies always smelled, of something faintly green and faintly sweet and faintly old-fashioned, and she said, more to the flowers than to Marco, the small 2-word phrase in Italian that her grandmother had always said when she was given flowers by men who had arrived unannounced. The phrase was not a thank you. It was an acknowledgement that the flowers existed, and that the giver had performed the courtesy of bringing them, and that the entire small ritual was now complete. Marco heard the phrase. His eyes did not change in any visible way, but a small, invisible thing passed across the space between them, the thing that passes between 2 people who have just discovered, in the span of a single utterance, that they are from the same country, in some way that is more important than the country printed on either of their passports. Sophia turned and walked toward the back of the bakery. She did not look to see whether Marco was following her. She knew that he was following her, in the same way she knew that the dough in the cold room had now been resting for 32 minutes, and had 8 minutes left before it needed to be turned again. She pushed through the swinging door and walked to the small espresso machine she kept on a low shelf beside the marble work table, and she set the peonies down on the counter beside the machine, and she began the small, precise ritual of grinding fresh beans and tamping the grounds and pulling a single shot into the small, white porcelain cup she had been using for her own afternoon coffee for 8 years. Marco followed her into the kitchen. He did not, however, sit at one of the front tables as she had offered. He stopped in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen, and stood there with his hands folded in front of him, in the small, respectful posture of a guest who had not yet been invited deeper into a host's space, and he watched her work the espresso machine with the slow, patient attention of a man who had been watching skilled workers all his life, and had learned to recognize the small distinctions between people who were performing skills and people who were inhabiting them. She set the small white cup on a saucer. She added a single small twist of lemon peel from the bowl beside the machine. She carried the cup and saucer to him in the doorway and offered them with both hands, in the small ceremonial gesture her grandmother had taught her was the correct way to offer coffee to a man who had arrived in your kitchen before the sun was up. He took the cup with both hands in return and inclined his head 1/4 of an inch, and he raised the cup briefly to his nose and breathed in once, and his eyes closed for the smallest possible moment, and when they opened again, he looked at her with an expression that contained a kind of careful, almost wistful recognition. He said that the coffee smelled like the coffee his mother used to make. He did not elaborate on where his mother had made coffee, or when she had made it, or what had happened to her, because he was a man who understood that certain sentences did not require elaboration, and because the recognition itself was the only piece of information that needed to pass between them. He raised the cup to his mouth and drank. Sophia returned to the marble. The timer had 4 minutes left. She did not yet need to do anything to the dough, but she did need to begin the small preparations for the next turn, which involved the cleaning of the marble surface with a single sweep of a fine flour brush and the laying out of the rolling pin in the precise position from which her right hand would reach for it without looking. She performed these preparations with the unhurried economy that the rest of her morning had been performed with, and while she performed them, she spoke to Marco over her shoulder in the soft, accented English she had been speaking since he arrived, and she asked him who he was. She did not ask him his employer's name. She asked him who he was. Marco understood the distinction. He had been answering questions about his identity for 40 years, and he had learned to recognize the difference between a question that was asking him to name a function and a question that was asking him to name a person. He took a second small sip of the coffee. He said in the same soft, accented English that he had been born in a small town in Calabria, in the year that her grandfather, if her grandfather had been the man Marco suspected he might have been, had still been alive, and had still been holding court in the courtyard of an old farmhouse in the western part of Sicily on Sunday afternoons after the long midday meal had finished. He said that his own father had been a fisherman in that small town, and that his father had died at sea when Marco was 11, and that his mother had moved with him to the city of Naples, and had raised him there, in the small back room of a bakery that was not unlike the small back room of the bakery he was now standing in, except that the bakery in Naples had been owned by his mother's brother, and had specialized in a particular kind of dense brown bread that was no longer made by anyone in this country. He said that he had left Naples when he was 19 years old, in the company of a man who had offered him a job that he had not at the time fully understood, and that he had been working for that man ever since, and that he had been in this country for 31 years, and that the man whose call she had ended 10 minutes ago was the son of the man who had brought him out of Naples. Sophia listened to all of this without turning around. The brush moved across the marble in the small, even sweeps her hand had been performing for 8 years. When Marco finished speaking, she set the brush down on the side of the marble and turned to look at him. She looked at his face for a long moment, and then at his hands, and then at the small white porcelain cup he was holding in those hands, and then back at his face, and she said that she had a question for him that she did not expect him to answer immediately. She asked him how he had known to come to her door with peonies. Marco considered the question. He considered it the way men of his generation had been taught to consider all of the most important questions, which was slowly, with the recognition that a hasty answer to such a question was always a worse answer than a careful one. He looked into the small white cup and watched the surface of the coffee for the duration of perhaps 4 seconds. Then he raised his eyes to her face and said that when his employer had ended the call 10 minutes ago and had described to Marco the woman he had just been hung up on, his employer had used a particular phrase to describe the manner of her speech. The phrase was not a complicated phrase. It was simply the observation that the woman on the other end of the line had spoken, in her brief refusal, with the kind of accent and the kind of cadence that his employer had not heard in this country in many years, and that his employer had recognized the cadence as the cadence of women from a particular region of a particular island, and that his employer had asked Marco, who knew the bakeries of the city better than anyone else in his employer's organization, whether he had ever encountered a baker on Vine Street who matched that description. Marco said that he had encountered her, in a small, accidental way, 2.5 years ago, when he had been driving past her bakery on a different errand, and had stopped to buy a loaf of bread, and had stood in front of her counter for the duration of perhaps 3 minutes while she was wrapping his loaf in brown paper, and that he had not, at the time, known anything more about her than what was visible in those 3 minutes, but that what was visible in those 3 minutes had been sufficient for him to conclude, even then, that the woman wrapping his bread had not been raised in this city or in this country, and that she had been raised in a place where women learned to wrap bread, the way his own mother had wrapped bread, with a particular small twist at the end of the paper that he had not seen any other baker in this country use. He said that he had remembered her this morning when his employer had described the phone call. He said that he had brought peonies because he had learned from his mother that women who wrapped bread in that particular way preferred peonies to roses, because peonies did not require the giver to make any specific declaration about his intentions and could therefore be received without obligation. Sophia did not respond immediately. The timer above the marble produced a small, soft chime to indicate that the dough was ready for its next turn, and she silenced it with a small motion of her left hand without looking at it, and she walked the 4 steps to the cold room and opened the door and removed the linen-wrapped tray and carried it back to the marble. She unwrapped the dough. She laid it flat. She picked up the rolling pin in the way her grandmother had taught her, and she began the 4th turn of the lamination. While she rolled, she spoke. She said, more to the dough than to Marco, that she had not been called by the name on her birth certificate in 20 years, and that she had not spoken about her grandfather to anyone in this country in 18, and that she had built the small life she now occupied, the bakery and the apartment and the routine of her mornings, and the routine of her afternoons, around a single decision she had made on a particular morning when she was 22 years old, in the courtyard of the same farmhouse where her grandfather had once held court. And the decision had been the decision to leave the world she had been born into, and to never, under any circumstances, allow that world to find her again. She said that she had been very careful about the implementation of this decision over the course of 20 years, and that the carefulness had become, in time, the entire architecture of her interior life, and that the small accidental things that gave her away to people like Marco, the cadence of her English, the twist at the end of the paper, the two-word Italian phrase she still said to flowers, were the things she had not been able to let go of, even after 20 years of trying, because they had been the things her grandmother had given her, and her grandmother was the only person in the entire world she had ever loved without reservation, and the things her grandmother had given her were the only things she had been unwilling to surrender even in the service of her own escape. She finished the fourth turn. She folded the dough. She wrapped it in the linen and returned it to the cold room. She set the timer for 40 more minutes. She turned to face Marco. She said that she would now like him to tell her the name of his employer. Marco set the small white cup down on the small wooden side table beside the doorway. He said the name. The name was a name Sophia had not heard before. She had not, in 8 years of running her bakery on Vine Street, paid any attention at all to the names of the men who ran the various criminal organizations of her adopted city, because she had built her life specifically around not knowing such names, and the name Marco had now given her therefore meant nothing to her in itself. But the name was attached, in Marco's careful presentation of it, to a small additional piece of information, which was that the man's father had grown up in a particular small town in the western part of Sicily, and that the small town was a town Sophia had visited many times as a child, because it was the town next to the town her grandfather's farmhouse had been in, and that Marco's employer's father had served, as a young man in the years before Sophia had been born, in some unspecified capacity in the small loose organization that her grandfather had presided over from the courtyard of the farmhouse on Sunday afternoons. Sophia listened to all of this without moving. When Marco finished, she walked to the small wooden stool beside the marble and sat down on it for the first time since she had risen from it to answer the phone almost an hour earlier. She placed her hands flat on her knees. She looked at the floor for a long time. Marco did not interrupt her. He understood that she was now performing some small private calculation that he had no business interrupting, and he stood very still in the doorway, with his hands folded in front of him, and waited for her to finish. When she lifted her eyes again, she looked not at Marco, but at a particular small framed photograph that hung on the wall to the left of the doorway he was standing in. The photograph was a black and white image of a young man in a vineyard holding a wooden basket of grapes against his hip, smiling at the camera with the half-embarrassed, half-pleased expression of a man who had not expected to be photographed and was now committed to the photograph. The young man in the photograph was Sophia's grandfather. He had been 23 years old when the photograph had been taken. The photograph had been taken by Sophia's grandmother, who had been 21 at the time and had not yet married him, in the small vineyard behind the farmhouse that would later belong to both of them and would later become the courtyard in which the men of the small loose organization would gather on Sunday afternoons. The photograph was the only object Sophia had brought with her from Sicily when she had left at 22. It had hung on the wall of every kitchen she had cooked in for 20 years, and it had hung on the wall of her bakery since the morning she had first unlocked the front door. None of her customers had ever asked her about it. She had counted on this. The kind of person who looked closely enough at a photograph in a bakery to ask about it was the kind of person who would have noticed other things about her, and she had spent 20 years not wanting to be noticed. Marco followed her gaze to the photograph. He looked at it for the duration of perhaps 3 seconds. Sophia watched him look. She watched the small, precise moment in which his eyes performed the necessary recognition, and she watched the small, involuntary contraction of his lips that occurred when the recognition had been completed, and she watched him close his eyes for a single full breath in the small, private gesture of a man who had just confirmed, by the most concrete possible evidence, a thing he had been suspecting since the moment she had opened her front door. He said in a voice that was quieter than the voice he had been using to describe his mother's coffee, the full name of her grandfather. He said it the way she had heard the men in the courtyard say it when she was a child, with the small particular emphasis that was used only by men who had known her grandfather personally, and not by any of the men who had simply heard about him afterward. He said that he had not, until this moment, been certain. He said that he was now certain. He said that his employer would want to know, and that he was asking her permission, before he told his employer, because he understood that the matter was hers, and not his. Sophia rose from the stool. She walked to the small wooden table where she kept the unbaked loaves of the simple country bread she sold during the day, and she picked up a clean linen cloth and began to fold it in the same small, precise trifold she had been performing on the dough an hour earlier, and she folded it slowly, several times while she thought. She thought about the morning 20 years earlier when she had walked out of the courtyard of the farmhouse for the last time. She thought about her grandmother, who had stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse and had watched her go, and who had not waved, because waving would have suggested that the leaving was temporary, and her grandmother had understood, before Sophia herself had fully understood, that the leaving was not going to be temporary. She thought about the small leather suitcase she had carried, and the photograph rolled inside a piece of brown paper at the bottom of the suitcase, and the few $100s in cash her grandmother had pressed into her hand the night before. She thought about the slow train to Palermo, and the boat to Naples, and the airplane to a city in this country, whose name she had chosen at random from a map on the wall of a travel agency. She thought about the 8 years she had spent waiting tables in 5 different restaurants in 3 different cities before she had saved enough to open the small bakery on Vine Street. She thought about the 8 years she had spent in the bakery itself, learning her customers' names, and her customers' children's names, and her customers' grandchildren's names, becoming, in the slow, accumulating way that solitary women in small businesses always became something to the neighborhoods they served, a person whose absence would be noticed if she ever stopped showing up. And she thought about the fact that the world she had left 20 years ago had now, by the small accidental routes that such worlds always traveled, found her. It had not found her by hunting her. It had found her by sending one of its lieutenants past her bakery on an unrelated errand 2.5 years ago, and by causing that lieutenant to remember the small twist at the end of her wrapping paper, and by causing his employer to call her at 4:20 in the morning to demand the use of her front room for a meeting, and by causing her to refuse the demand in the particular accent that had given her away. The world had found her without intending to. The world had found her through the very things her grandmother had given her and that she had not been able to surrender. There was, she thought, a certain fairness in this. The things you could not let go of were the things by which you would eventually be found. She finished folding the linen cloth. She set it down on the wooden table. She turned back to Marco. She said that he could tell his employer who she was on 3 conditions. The first condition was that the meeting his employer had wanted to hold at her bakery on the coming Thursday afternoon would not be held at her bakery on this Thursday or on any other Thursday, ever, under any circumstances. The second condition was that if his employer wished to meet her in person, the meeting would be held not at her bakery, and not at any of his employer's properties, but at the small chapel 3 blocks east on the corner of Vine and 8th, on Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, before the 7 o'clock Mass, in the small side chapel where the votive candles were kept. The third condition was that his employer would come alone, without Marco, and without any of the other men who ordinarily traveled in his company, and that the conversation would last no longer than 10 minutes, and that nothing said in the conversation would obligate Sophia to anything beyond the conversation itself. Marco listened to the conditions. When she had finished speaking, he inclined his head 1/4 of an inch, in the same gesture he had used when she had opened her door an hour earlier, and he said that he would convey the conditions to his employer, and that he believed his employer would accept them, and that he would be in touch through whatever channel she preferred to confirm. Sophia said that he could leave a small written note in the wooden box bolted to the wall outside her front door, the one she used to receive deliveries from her flour supplier on the days she was not yet open. Marco nodded. Then he picked up the small white cup and saucer from the table beside the doorway, and he carried them carefully back to the marble work surface and set them down beside the espresso machine, and he turned to face her one more time. He said that he had not, in the course of the last hour, been certain whether she would want him to mention any of what they had now discussed to anyone else in his employer's organization beyond his employer himself. He said that he was now asking her, directly, what she would prefer. Sophia said that she would prefer that he mention it to no one else, and that she would prefer that his employer also mention it to no one else, and that the matter of who she was should remain a matter known to 3 people in this country and no more. Marco said that he understood, and that he would communicate this to his employer, and that he believed his employer would also understand. He let himself out of the kitchen and back through the swinging door and across the dark front room of the bakery, and he opened the front door and stepped out onto the wet sidewalk, and he closed the door behind him with the same small attention to its hardware that he had used to open it an hour earlier. And Sophia listened to his footsteps recede along the sidewalk in the direction of whatever vehicle had been waiting at its deliberate distance. The footsteps reached a particular point about 200 feet down the block and then disappeared, and a few seconds later the engine of a car turned over very softly, and the car pulled away into the slow pre-dawn traffic of the city, and the street outside her bakery was empty again. She returned to the marble. The timer above the marble had 18 minutes left on it. She walked to the small sink and washed her hands again in cold water and dried them on the white towel, and she returned to the wooden stool and sat down, and she placed her hands flat on her knees and breathed slowly through her nose for the duration of perhaps 2 full minutes. The bakery around her was the same bakery it had been an hour earlier. The marble was the same marble. The cold room was the same cold room. The photograph on the wall to the left of the doorway was the same photograph. Nothing in the small physical architecture of the room she had built around herself had changed in any visible way. The only thing that had changed was that the room now contained a piece of information that had not existed inside it an hour earlier, and the information had been carried in by a man with a bouquet of peonies, and the information was that her grandfather's name had been spoken aloud in her own kitchen for the first time in 20 years, and that the speaking of it had not, contrary to everything she had spent those 20 years preparing for, ended her life. She rose from the stool when the timer chimed. She returned to the dough. She performed the 5th turn, and the 6th, and the 7th and final turn after that, with the same unhurried economy with which she had performed every turn of every batch of croissants she had made in 8 years. She rolled the laminated dough into its final long sheet and cut the triangles for the croissants, and shaped each triangle around its small hidden pocket of butter, and laid the shaped croissants out on the long baking trays, and covered the trays with linen cloths, and set them in the warm corner near the back oven to perform their final proof. The sun rose outside the front window of the bakery while she was working. The light came in through the glass in the slow, gradual way that the early morning light always came in, and it touched the 7 small round tables, and the brass cash register, and the chalkboard menu, and the small framed photograph of the young man in the vineyard, and the photograph took on the soft amber tone that all old photographs took on in morning light, and Sophia, glancing at it once across the length of the bakery while she was wiping down the marble for the day's work, thought that her grandmother would have liked the way the light fell across her grandfather's face this morning. The meeting at the chapel took place on the following Sunday at 6 o'clock in the morning, in the small side chapel where the votive candles were kept, and it lasted exactly 9 minutes, and Sophia did not, on the morning of it, or on any morning afterward, describe to anyone what was said during those 9 minutes. The man who came to meet her arrived alone, in a plain dark coat, without any of the usual indicators of his station, and he stopped just inside the side chapel and lit a single candle in the rack of red glass votives before he turned to face her, and he addressed her by the name on her birth certificate, in the same accent his father had used to address her grandmother 40 years earlier, in a courtyard in the western part of Sicily, and he kissed the back of her right hand, in the small, precise gesture that the men of her grandfather's generation had used when greeting the women of his household, and he said the small 2-word Italian phrase that meant, depending on who was saying it, and to whom, either a formal greeting or a complete declaration of fealty. Sophia did not require him to clarify which of the two he had intended. She suspected, in any case, that the answer was both. She returned to the bakery after the meeting and unlocked the front door at 6:30 as she did every morning, and she pulled the linen cloths off the trays of croissants that had been in the front warmer since she had baked them at 5:15, and she arranged them in the glass case, in the small overlapping rows. Her hands had been arranging them in for 8 years, and she turned the small cardboard sign on the door from closed to open, and the first customers of the day began to drift in along Vine Street in their usual small, slow procession. The bakery on Vine Street did not change in any visible way in the months and years that followed. The croissants did not change. The country bread did not change. The 7 small round tables and the chalkboard menu, and the brass cash register and the small framed photograph of the young man in the vineyard did not change. The hours did not change, and the prices did not change, and Sophia did not, at any point, allow her bakery to be reserved for a private meeting by anyone, regardless of the amount they offered or the importance of their purposes. The man whose call she had ended at 4:20 in the morning on a Tuesday did not call her again. He came into the bakery occasionally, no more than 3 or 4 times a year, always alone, always during ordinary business hours, always wearing the plain dark coat she had first seen him in at the chapel, and he always bought a small loaf of the country bread and a single croissant, and he always paid in cash, and he never sat down at any of the 7 small tables, and he never spoke to her beyond the small ordinary courtesies that any baker exchanged with any customer. The other customers in the bakery did not, on any of these occasions, recognize him, because he had taken some care over the years to make himself difficult to recognize in places where he did not wish to be recognized. Sophia, watching him from behind the counter, observed that his clothes had become plainer over the months, and that the small, careful tension in his shoulders, that she had not been close enough to register at the chapel, had gradually loosened, and that he had begun, sometime in the 2nd year of his visits, to greet her by the name on her sign, rather than by the name on her birth certificate. Marco came in too, on occasion, also alone, also during ordinary hours, also always paying cash. He bought, every time, the same dense brown loaf his mother had baked in the small bakery in Naples, which Sophia had not made before she met him, but which she had begun to make, on Wednesdays and Saturdays only, in his honor, after the 3rd time he had asked her in passing whether she ever made anything in that style. The brown loaf was now one of her most popular breads. None of the customers who bought it knew who it had been started for. There was a small framed photograph that Sophia hung on the wall by the front door of the bakery in the 2nd year after the meeting in the chapel. It was a copy of the photograph that had hung beside the kitchen doorway for 8 years already, the photograph of the young man in the vineyard with the wooden basket of grapes against his hip. The original photograph remained where it had always been. The new photograph, hanging by the front door at eye level for any customer who paused to look at it, was not labeled. None of the customers asked Sophia who the young man in the photograph was. A few of them, on certain Sunday mornings, stood in front of it for a long moment before they ordered their bread, and 1 or 2 of them crossed themselves quietly, and then they came to the counter and asked for a baguette, or a brioche, or a small loaf of the country bread, and Sophia served them, and the bakery went on. Her grandmother had told her once in the kitchen of the farmhouse that the things you carried with you out of the places you ran from were the things that would, eventually, make the places you ran to into homes. Sophia had not understood the sentence at the time. She had been 12 years old, and she had been more interested in the small spinning top her grandfather had brought her from a market in Palermo than in anything her grandmother was saying. She had remembered the sentence anyway, in the way that children sometimes remembered the sentences of their grandmothers without understanding them, and she had understood it, finally, on the morning a man in a long dark coat had stood in the doorway of her kitchen with a bouquet of white peonies in his hands, and had spoken her grandfather's name in the accent of the country she had left, and she had understood in that single moment that she had not, in 20 years, run far enough to leave behind any of the things that mattered, and that the things she had not been able to leave behind were the only things by which she had ever been worth finding. There are people who believe that the way to keep a thing safe is to hide it. There are other people who understand that the way to keep a thing safe is to set it down in the open, in the room where you do your work, on the wall by the door where everyone who comes in will see it, and to trust that the people who recognize it will recognize it for the right reasons, and to trust that the people who do not recognize it will leave it alone, and to go on with your work, and to make your bread, and to wait. The bread, in the end, is the only thing that has ever mattered. The bread, in the end, is the only thing that has ever been worth waiting for.